just on that as well, there's one thing as well that we have going for us in an advantage way in regards to our like resistance training and the types of training we might expose ourselves to in the gym or even outside running or whatever. Like we have more control, so we actually like if we were to do a sport, like we've given obviously the extreme example of a
Yeah.
sport like fighting or whatever. But if you were to do just I don't know football, soccer if you want, right? Um, if you were to do that, you're exposing yourself to a degree of randomness. Like yes, you have to run forward, you have to run back, side to side, turn a pace, blah blah blah. Maybe you might get a tackle here or there, but even though you can kind of identify, oh yeah, these are the rough movements that I'm going to do, there's such a huge degree of randomness in terms of how you actually execute those movements on the field and then interact with those around you. Whereas in the gym, like you can pretty much get rid of a huge amount of randomness. Now, you're still going to be exposed to some, I don't know, like someone knocks into your bar while you're benching or you're deadlifting. Like there's obviously a degree of randomness there. But for a lot of the stuff, the actual degree of randomness that you're going to experience is actually modifiable, like by pushing, closer or further away from failure, by choosing different exercises. So the fact that you have such a huge control over how much randomness is in your training versus the, sporting athlete gives you a huge amount of control over how you actually manage your injury risk.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really important point because what I always say to people, to my clients, is that look, sport is chaotic. And that's why it's at the end of the spectrum when it comes to return to sport. That's all. Like if someone, let's say, is going through rehab post ACL reconstruction or a similar type of injury, the way you typically will walk the person along that kind of path is, they'll start by doing the restoration of range of motion and very light resistance exercises. Okay, that's going to be kind of at the start. Then they'll expose themselves to, slightly heavier resistance work. So they're trying to bring back their quad strength. They might do a box squat or they might do a leg press or something like that. And over time, they'll work up to heavier weights and they'll start to do cycling, which is it's fixed. Well, you can do that quite early on, but it's a fixed plane of movement pretty much. Your feet are locked in, the bike isn't going anywhere. You're on a stationary bike. Over time, then straight line jogging, for example, some straight line jumping. Then you'll go maybe running with some changes of direction that are known. So you know what direction you're changing in. If you were running up to a T and you're running to your left, that's all known and predictable. But when it comes to sport itself, it's unpredictable. Okay, so you don't know what direction you might have to run in next, or you don't know how your opponent's going to react, and you need to be able to react really quickly. And often the movements you're going to be doing are pretty much subconscious. Okay, you know where you want to go, but you're not, controlling how much plantar flexion or how much knee flexion, etc. And that makes sport very chaotic, and it makes it virtually impossible to predict the forces that you're going to have to deal with, because you don't know if your foot's going to land on your forefoot with a certain amount of knee rotation and valgus, etc. These are the types of things that happen in normal sporting movements that basically never really happen in the gym. Like if someone was squatting and they suddenly came up onto their toes and both their knees collapsed together, like that'd be a pretty big error. Like that would basically never happen. More or less, you're never going to see someone do that in the gym and then finish their rep and be like, oh yeah, that's normal. But that happens normally in sport all of the time. And it also happens under very high forces, because you might say, oh, well, yeah, but with a barbell on your back, it's totally different. But if someone's sprinting and they jump and then they have to change direction and they're in a position that they've never been in before, super high forces as well. Okay, so sport is very chaotic. That's the very simple point. Now, as you say, most of us don't have to expose ourselves to that. And specifically when it comes to talking about resistance training, we certainly don't have to be exposed to that. Resistance training is very controlled. Even if you're doing fast reps, the range of motion is still pretty much controlled. The amount of weight on the bar is controlled. You know what you're lifting. Okay, so all these things are fixed from the get-go. And as a result, you can dramatically reduce your risk of injury by simply controlling a couple of other things, because the weight is fixed, the range of motion is probably fixed, let's say. Let's say you're controlling your tempo. Now, what comes after that? It's the things like the amount of volume you're doing, the number of sets that you're doing, how close to failure you're going, how much weight you're lifting. Is it appropriate for you to be lifting this weight? When you put all these different things together, it actually becomes relatively easy to significantly reduce your risk of injury. You're never going to take it to zero because things happen and there's always an element of unpredictability, but you can dramatically reduce the risk. And I'll start by kind of going through those things that I initially kind of took for granted. So number one would be, let's say, just the range of motion. Okay, the range of motion that you work through. Very often this is standardized in that people will do a barbell bench press and they'll start from straight arms and they'll bring the bar down to their chest. It's standardized, or at least it looks to be so. But the reality is that that's not actually a requirement, okay? Unless you're a powerlifter, it's not a requirement that you touch your chest. And it's also not a requirement that you would do the barbell bench press in the first place. So in the case that someone found this exercise to be provocative, that they had shoulder pain or recurring elbow pain on this exercise, it's actually quite simple to just say, one, don't do the exercise. But in this conversation, we're trying to avoid that because that's just an easy way out. But what you can do here is say, I'm going to actually modify the range of motion, okay? Or the joint positioning. So for example, you might stop or pause the weight 2 or 3 inches off your chest. Generally, what you'll find is that when people have shoulder pain or any type of pain associated with the bench press, it's the bottom of the rep at which this is, greatest. So as a result, if someone stops a few inches short, you can modify their symptoms. So that'll be kind of a fairly simple thing to do. But that's just range of motion taken very simply from, I guess, the external view. The other things you could do here would be to change, for example, your elbow position. What you do when you change your elbow position, for example, elbows flared out versus elbows in against your side, is you're actually changing the angle of abduction or adduction at the shoulder. And this modifies the forces that you're going to deal with in the shoulder and the forces that you're going to deal with at the elbow. So as a result, this change is technically a change in the range of motion because you're changing the way the joints are moving. So again, that's something that could potentially be changed and could be changed in basically many different exercises. So for example, a lat pull down, you might do a wider grip versus a narrow grip. If you're doing a squat, you might take a wider stance or a narrower stance. All these different things can be changed that are also involved in that range of motion discussion because different muscles will be taken to different lengths. For example, with the bench press, obviously, if you take your elbows and you flare them way out, you're going to be taking your shoulder closer to its end range of motion in that position. You're also going to be, changing the way that you're working certain pec fibers, etc. So you could go through every single exercise and discuss all those things. But the very simple point is that range of motion and the kind of joint positioning within that is a really simple way to modify the forces that you're dealing with in the presence of injury. And it also doesn't have to be the case that you wait until injury until you change these things, because there's very often a tolerable level of pain or discomfort that people will basically have long-term and not call it injury. You've got that bad shoulder. That's what people will say, oh, I've just got a bit of a dodgy shoulder. It's never been great. And it kind of just gets a bit sore if I do too much, that's the type of thing people will say, but they'll say, it's not an injury really. And it's kind of a fair point, these things with long-term training careers, they will kind of be present and it's kind of a normal part of the training process. But what you might do in that case is, if this is constantly being flared up by the barbell bench press as you touch your chest, then you might change your range of motion proactively. You might say, right, if the bottom of this rep is constantly aggravating me, or the bottom of a squat or whatever, then why don't I modify this and continue to do it long term? And then you might be able to do higher quality training volume because you're no longer getting sore as quickly and you're reducing the risk of that injury potentially getting worse in the future. So that's range of motion. Okay. The next thing would be something like tempo, which is very much related here, where repetition tempo, effectively what you're doing is, if you slow down the tempo, again, you're reducing the chaos or the randomness, because the faster you move, the more chaos there is effectively. Okay. Because if you drop the bar down and let's just say the bench press is just an easy example. Again, if you drop the bar aggressively from the top and you slap it off your chest, okay, it's not 100%, you can't predict what direction that bar is going to bounce in. You know, it might bounce slightly to the front, slightly to the back, slightly to the left. There's just an extra element of randomness that gets put in there. You're also dealing with very, very high forces because that bar is accelerating very quickly towards your chest. You're not applying much deceleration or decelerating force against it. So as a result, the forces you're dealing with at the bottom are much, much greater because there's far more momentum that bar is carrying. As a result, you then require a lot more force to be able to change that direction and to accelerate the bar upwards again. So with that in mind, if you slow down your reps, that means you're dealing with less of a spike in forces at the bottom. So a slower eccentric, less of a spike in force at the bottom. This becomes very relevant for people who have, again, those type pains or injuries that are aggravated at that change of direction. The bottom of a squat is a classic one. People drop aggressively into the bottom of their squat, and their knees, don't feel so great after it. And understandably so, because you're dropping aggressively, increasing that spike in forces at the bottom, at the knees end range of flexion. Whereas if you were to slow that down, find a comfortable end point and slowly change direction, that would modify, obviously, one, the weight that you lift, because you're not going to lift the same amount of weight, but two, the magnitude of that increase in forces that you deal with because of the momentum. So tempo can be quite a powerful thing there. It's not always very predictable how tempo will impact you either, because sometimes you'll find that if you slow down your reps too much, then maybe you focus on a certain muscle over another, or you find that you're concentrating too much on the area that's injured. So there's many different ways to interpret that. But as a rule of thumb, slower reps are typically going to reduce risk of injury over time because of reducing that chaos. Obviously, that assumes that you're holding everything else equal. And it's not just reducing the randomness or chaos, I should say. It's also the fact that you're modifying the forces. Okay, that's predictable.
Practically speaking, you're probably getting more tension on the actual muscles that you want to target, and as a result of that, you're probably getting better results. You're probably getting actual muscle growth rather than just fucking pain.
Yeah, and again, you could take it even further and talk about that with reference to like different tissues and stuff as well. Like one of the classic ones I would deal with a lot is tendon injuries. So people who have tendon injuries, if you're aggressively changing direction with a tendon injury, like a patellar tendinopathy or Achilles tendinopathy, that's typically a lot more provocative because the function of tendons, more or less, very simple way of describing it would be to kind of store and release energy. So anytime you're doing bouncing type activities like jumping up and down, or you aggressively change direction at the bottom of the squat, you bounce out of the bottom, your tendons are taking a hell of a lot of load there. So as a result, slowing down your tempo and being more controlled and predictable in those cases can be very beneficial. Other things would be like if you have had a history of muscle strain, let's say you've had a pec tear in the past or pec strain, and you're changing direction at the bottom, doing that with control, finding that endpoint and changing with control is going to be a lot more beneficial. If you change direction aggressively and spike the forces at the point where the muscle was previously injured, for example, in that lengthened range, then again, that's putting you in the higher risk category. So tempo, definitely something that can be modified here. Furthermore, the other things that you might consider are those bigger picture training principles. So volume is a huge one, where people will just do so many sets for a given muscle group and then wonder why their shoulder or knee or hip or back is sore. The classic one is the kind of push workout that people will do, where people will do a flat barbell bench press and then a flat dumbbell bench press and then an incline dumbbell bench press and then a machine chest press and then a 90-degree dumbbell shoulder press. You get the picture. You're basically doing 5 or 6 different pressing movements, and you might be doing 4 sets per exercise. So you're doing 20 plus sets of pressing or similar loading on that shoulder joint or chest or shoulder muscle. You're doing 20 plus sets of that within a given session. And then you might do that a second time that week. Okay. Very, very difficult to recover from that. So in general, what you want to do is, one, start at a lower level of volume. Okay. If you find that you get to a certain point in your workout, maybe it's the 9th or 10th set and the shoulder starts to get at you, but you push on anyway, start below that threshold. So it might be that you start by doing 8 sets at each workout per muscle. And then you build up gradually from that, and you find where that threshold is, and you find how much you can do to get results. So, what leaves you feeling like you've gotten a good workout in, you got a good pump, you get a bit of soreness the next day, but not too much, and your joints aren't sore. That's kind of what you're looking for really when you're designing a workout and allocating volume. So you moderate your volume. Okay. You bring it down a bit. You're not, and most importantly, I think here, when people get told to reduce their volume or the number of sets they're doing, they think, oh no, I can't, because that's going to reduce my results. But the reality is that when we say things like more volume equals more muscle building, let's say, which is a very simple statement and not always true. But when we say that, effectively what we're assuming is that that's high quality work and that each unit of volume is equal. Whereas that's often not the case, especially in cases where people are experiencing pain or injury. Because if someone has shoulder pain and they're doing 20 sets for chest, the first 8 to 10 sets might be of high quality, but the remainder, the limiting factor is no longer their chest, but rather the shoulder pain. That happens so frequently where someone won't be able to lift the same amount of weight or do the same amount of reps because of pain, but they still do sets over and over again. So that additional 5 to 10 sets or whatever at the end of your workout that are painful, they may be contributing vastly less than the first 5 or 10 sets that you're doing at the beginning of your workout. So if you were able to cut those and focus on the higher quality stuff, you'd probably have better recovery, less pain, and better results, which sounds like an absolute win to me. So moderate your volume, no harm in doing so. The other thing I was going to say on volume as well is, oh yes, diversifying. Okay. So you want to diversify your volume across a number of different exercises too. And not just exercises, but exercises that have maybe different paths of motion or different resistance profiles. For example, if you're doing chest and you're doing 12 sets of barbell bench press, that's clearly very different to doing 12 set or doing 4 sets of barbell bench press, 3 sets of a machine chest press, 3 sets of cable flies, and I don't know, 2 sets of bodyweight push-ups at the end. They're all slightly different in the way that they're loading the chest and the way that they're loading the shoulder. And as a result, I would typically expect someone to be able to handle a higher dose of volume when it's diversified across those different movements than if someone's doing it all on the one movement. Okay. So diversification, kind of a fundamental principle there that you can apply when you're allocating your volume. So not just the absolute amount of volume, but also, obviously the types of exercises, but also the diversity of those exercises.